Welcome, my friends, to Everything is Golden. It is a high honor that I introduce you to one of my dearest, best, wonderful friends in this life, who also happens to be, fortunately for her, retired from the media and enjoying her life. But her media experience was different than mine. She grew up with the Canadian media. That's where she spent most of her career, and thus is kind of an expert. She's Canadian. As so many, I have to say this, as so many these days of the people that retain a sense of what journalism used to be. You don't find a lot of that in the American media landscape anymore. But when you do, if you're fortunate enough to find some of the old school, and I don't mean that as a pejorative, Canadian journalists, they actually have those journalistic standards that used to be common even in America. And sadly, they don't. So without any further ado, my good friend, Debi Pelletier, is with us today. Hello.
It took you 6 months to convince me to come on.
Yes, exactly. But now you're here. And I don't want to do Orange Man Bad today. So, but I do want to talk about Canada and this relationship that America has with Canada. But one of the first things I'd like for you to do is explain to us how the Canadian government sort of works. 1 minute we see Justin Trudeau was there. The next minute, of course, this took over a period of months. He was gone. Then you have another PM guy, Ford, speaking up from Ontario and sounding like he runs things there. So basics, let's go to basics. Explain Canada to the United States. We have our 50 states. We have governors. We have senators. We have Congress people. And then we have the locals, the state governments, which is basically a replication with their own state legislature, Senate, assemblies, or Congress, the House, if you want to call it that. Then you go down to the municipal level, and there you can get into your city councils. But anyway, it's pretty clear to a lot of Americans how that structure is supposed to operate. And I find myself sometimes confused as to how Canada operates. So help me understand and help us understand how Canada operates.
Well, the political structure is not dissimilar. There is a federal government similar to, the government in Washington, D.C., the feds. And instead of governors and state legislatures, there are provincial legislatures. But there are 10 provinces in Canada, and now there are 3 territories. The territories are not full-fledged provinces, but they enjoy all the basically statehood type of sovereignty the way the rest of the provinces do. So when there's a federal election, people vote for the parties. They don't vote for the leader. They don't vote for the prime minister the way we vote for the president here. So once like when Justin Trudeau resigned, the Liberals had to get a leader to take them into the next election. That election is held has to be held within 5 years, every 5 years. But the prime minister has the option to call it anytime in between. So there is never a set date when it's election day in Canada. The date is usually October. That's the 5-year time. And that's mostly because in parts of Canada, after October, it's too cold, too much snow to get out and vote. So that goes for the entire 10 provinces and 3 territories. They vote for a party. And since the party has a leader, that leader becomes prime minister. The provinces are, again, pretty similar. You vote for your provincial legislature. They represent the different sections of the province, and they promulgate whatever laws they need to that are specific to their province. The provinces have jurisdiction over certain things that are provincially important, whereas the federal government has jurisdiction over national issues such as criminal law or borders or international trade. Anything that's of national importance is under the purview of the federal government. So the similarities are there. It's not a whole lot different. There is a Senate in Canada. The House of Commons is the body that creates the legislation. The Senate is basically the body that approves it or challenges it or comes up with mistakes that need to be rectified. But the Senate is appointed, it's not elected. And for the most part in Canada, the Senate basically rubber stamps whatever comes out of the House of Commons. So that's essentially it. The Canadians, we used to say that.
Wait, hold on. So you don't get into this thing that we have here between the Senate and the House, where you have these battles and they could be different. For instance, when it's not what we have right now is a trifecta, thankfully, with very narrow windows of control of the House, the Senate, and the presidency in one party. But when you do have a mixed bag here, very often you'll find gridlock as the result, because either the House will be in the hands of one party, the Senate in another party, and they are actually, you need both of them to move legislation forward to the president's desk. So that situation doesn't happen so much in Canada.
No, and basically the joke has always been, once you elect a government in Canada, you've elected a dictatorship for the next 5 years, because there's really not much you can do to change things at that point. If the House of Commons votes on a bill and it passes, the Senate could theoretically stall it or kill it, but it's probably only happened less than a handful of times in Canadian history. And other than that, there's not a whole lot. There's no impeachment per se. The way it works there is that there are, for the most part, three main parties. The Tories, the Conservatives, which are the more right of center, the Liberals, and the NDP, which stands for the New Democratic Party, which tends to be the more left of center. But really in Canada, if you compared to the US, everybody's a little left of center, just it's varying degrees. Then you have some new outliers that are regional parties or the Green Party, but they don't really have a huge role in government at all. So what happens, the only way really you can get rid of a prime minister is by having a vote of non-confidence. And it's got to be the members from the floor who raise the vote of non-confidence. And that's almost a pro forma after every budget. But when, for example, Trudeau was facing different votes of non-confidence, and he survived them because they were a minority government, as was the government before him under Stephen Harper, which was a conservative government. He was, I think, in power 10 years in a minority government. So there they work with people across the aisle. There is a lot more collaboration and cooperation compared to what's going on in the US now when it comes to crossing the aisle to work together in the House of Commons.
Isn't that due to the nature of, like you keep saying, the minority government? Because you have these three basic parties, and depending on how many seats they win, it's like when you look at British politics or where the parliamentary system is, they have to form coalition governments. They have to make deals with other parties in order to stay in power anyway.
Yes, that's exactly.
So it's a tenuous kind of relationship. You can't cross certain lines because these parties will say, all right, we withdraw our support, the whole government falls.
Correct. Yep. It is the parliamentary system. That's how it works in Canada.
So you have these 10 provinces, of which I know of British Columbia. Thank you. I know of Ontario, where this Ford guy is running his, excuse me, let me be nice. Ford guy, who isn't he related to the crackhead Ford that was running things up there for a while?
That was his brother, Mayor of Toronto. Yep.
Mayor of Toronto, crackhead. He and Marion Barry could have been good friends.
They might have been.
They might have been. So you have that. And then of course there's Brunswick, there's Alberta, right? Or so Calgary. Which I don't know what are the other provinces up there?
Starting on the Pacific coast, there's British Columbia, which is Canada's version of California. Then there's Alberta, which is Canada's version of Texas. Then there's Saskatchewan, Manitoba, which is like Idaho, Montana. It's the prairie provinces. Saskatchewan, Manitoba. Then you get to Ontario, which is the largest and most populated province. Then Quebec. And then you hit New Brunswick, small little New Brunswick, even smaller Nova Scotia. Then you've got Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland, and Cape Breton Island. And then the territories, in the territories, you've got Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, and now the whole top of the continent is part of Indigenous territory called Nunavut. And it's a self-governing Aboriginal Native First Nations territory.
Oh, wait a minute. So they did their version of the reservation and they shipped all the indigenous people up north where it's really cold and just that's the way it worked?
No, not at all. No, in Canada, very few tribal rights were ever signed away. There are very few treaties that were ever negotiated. So for the most part, a lot of Aboriginal First Nations land is Native territory. Most of British Columbia, Alberta is Native territory. And the Supreme Court of Canada, probably going on 20 years ago, recognized Native rights and to the land and to the resources there. And so those communities very much are aware of that fact, and everybody works together. And it's evolved over time. When I lived in the north, it was very different. But now the Native people own schools, own governments, own self-determination. And they enforce their own laws, very much like any province would.
So if we end up with Canada as the 51st state, that means we got to do a separate deal with the Indigenous people too?
They're part of the Union of Canada, but...
So then that would be, it'd be an all-inclusive. I got it. Okay, so I don't want to go too far off into that.
Good luck with that. Good luck with that. You try negotiating through the Arctic Circle in the dead of winter. Yeah, good luck with that.
Okay, but I do want to talk about one thing without getting too knee deep into the political heat of the day, which is you and I had a discussion, and I'm so glad we did because it helped me understand something. President Trump has said that, okay, one of the things that he's pointed out is the trade imbalance that we have with Canada. I understand that some of the figures are in dispute, how shall we say, but one thing isn't, and you and I discussed this, and I found it really enlightening, which is the dairy, because that one I said, okay, I'm aware of this one. I'm slightly aware of what's going on with the timber, because you and I have talked about that in the past too. But there are a lot of nuances with the whole timber thing that I still don't understand, quite frankly. And I also know that there are certain products that in timber that aren't in America. There are certain types of woods that you can only find up in that region of the world, like Alaskan, which we have in Alaska, but primarily in BC, like yellow cedar. I get that. But the dairy, I think, is really understandable. Everybody, especially given the price of dairy products these days. So Donald Trump has said that Canada has, I forget what it was, a 400% or whatever, 200%. They tariff American dairy to the point that Americans cannot sell dairy products into Canada. And that's one of the things that Donald Trump says he's hoping to correct with reciprocal tariffs. So I asked you, why doesn't Canada allow American dairy products to sell in Canada? And I'm asking you again, so we can talk about that for a minute.
Well, American products are sold in Canada under the two different North American free trade agreements, including the most recent one. There were quotas set about how much could be sold on either side of the border. And once that amount is reached, then the Canadian tariffs are kicked in. But that amount has never been reached. So those tariffs have not kicked in. Canada operates under a supply management system. So, and that's because, again, it's a vast country with not a whole lot of people. There's 40 million people in Canada. What's that? The population of Florida. And in a territory that's the second largest in the world. So what you've got are not a lot of farmers and not a lot of market to make sure that these guys can actually make a living and keep producing their dairy. There has to be, everybody has to have a piece of the pie. There's got to be a certain amount that everybody is guaranteed to be able to produce and sell so they can keep producing and selling. That's how it works in Canada, and that's for milk, butter, that kind of thing. So it's not, the whole tariff thing doesn't even really, in practical terms, exist because the supplies of milk going from the US to Canada have never reached that level where they've maxed out the quote unquote allowance that was provided for in the trade agreement. So those tariffs aren't being applied at the moment. And the other issue with that is, again, you've got a much bigger pool of producers in the US and a much smaller pool of producers in Canada. So if that was opened, wide open, there would be no Canadian dairy industry at that point. And to Canada, agriculture is very important. The two big producing countries in Canada, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and parts of Alberta, that's pretty much all dependent on agriculture. So you would wipe out that whole center part of the country economically.
And so that's where you see maybe this, and you're saying the tariffs aren't never reached, but even so, what we're saying is that this is not protectionism from the standpoint that people usually think about protectionism.
It's survival.
This is about the preservation of, well, maybe it is the way that people
survival. It's like in the U.S., farmers in the U.S. are supported through tax breaks and tax incentives. In Canada, they're supported through a supply management system. Now, they weren't real happy about it when it all first started because it meant some producers couldn't take over the market. That's a very fundamental difference between the way Canadians operate and think versus in the US. It is more collaborative. It is quote unquote more socialist. Everybody gets a piece, not one person coming in and consuming all the rest in order to dominate.
Yeah, it'll be kind of tough for you guys to adjust if we end up. Okay, so let's just delve into it without. What do you think the chances are of a new kind of relationship between the United States and Canada?
Well, I think it's already started. I think the new relationship is already starting to come into play. The history between Canada and the U.S. has always been of allies and collaboration and friendship. But even back in the days of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the first Trudeau who was prime minister, he used to talk about how Canada has to learn to live and sleep with the giant on the other side of the border. He likened it to being the mouse sleeping with the elephant. They roll over, we get crushed. So Canada's been acutely aware of that for as long as I've been around. But this change in relationship, these comments about turning Canada into the 51st state, that's really shocked people. They never thought they would see that. As a result, everybody's digging their heels in. It's not the same situation, but when you look at the resolve and the determination of the Ukrainians against the vast Russians, you're going to have the same kind of attitude in Canada toward the United States. The heels will dig in. People will do without. People will do whatever necessary in order to keep Canada sovereign and operating as an independent country. People in Canada are very nice until you push them against the wall, and they'll fight back. That's the fangs come out.
Yeah, but okay, without would be nice.
People underestimate just how different Canadians are from Americans.
Okay, you people don't have any guns. You keep the guns all locked away. You don't have any guns. You don't have a big military. You don't have a big air force. You don't have a big navy. You don't have any atomic weapons if it ever got to that. You don't have any. What do you have? What
We have the uranium. We have the uranium that other countries need to make their atomic weapons. We have.
We'll take it. I mean, if it came down to that, and I know, trust me.
Right. But really, is it going to come down to is the U.S. going to send the troops into Canada and take it by force? Really?
For my dear Canadian friends, I am not advocating a hostile takeover of Canada. I want that to be clear.
That's pretty much the only way it can happen, I think. In my opinion, it won't happen any other way. And I could be wrong.
Look, here's what I said.
Going to happen.
Here's what I said to you. Here's what I said to you when we first began talking about, all jokes aside, because I've been saying for decades that we need to take over Canada.
Yeah.
And I have been for decades. I've been saying, you know what, we just need to take over Canada. I never thought that it would actually be on the table. That said, you look at the situation that Britain had with Northern Ireland, and how long had that been going on before there was
decades,
right, an uneasy peace that was finally brokered, and things seem to be okay now, but it took a long time for that to happen. If you mentioned the Ukrainian-Russia situation, there I don't want to delve off it because that's a whole nother podcast. But people look at that, and I think from the United States standpoint, one of the things that struck me with that was that when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened in the United States of America, we have new president John Kennedy, 1960. Russia, Soviet Union then, decides that they want to park some nuclear weapons in Cuba 90 miles away from America's border, Florida. And Jack Kennedy and all the bunch say, oh, hell no, not going to happen. You will start a nuclear war like this. You are not going to put nuclear weapons that close to our border. Well, under the Biden administration, it was common talk that Ukraine might perhaps become part of NATO. The whole reason for NATO's existence was to fight off the threat of the then Soviet Union and the Cold War. And so Vlad, think of him what you may, and I'm not a Vladimir Putin lover by any standpoint at all, but Vladimir Putin says, no, you are not going to put NATO on our doorstep. Not that we share a border. In fact, the history of Russia and Ukraine, you know this, is like one of these biblical things that keeps going back through century upon century. At some point, they're part of Russia. At some point, they're not part of Russia. At some point, they're part of Russia again. At some point, they're not part of Russia. This whole thing, we're talking like 1,000-year history, or at least 600-year history, I think, that goes back between these two nations where sometimes it's friendly, sometimes it's not. But I think everyone could understand, I think most people might understand, that Putin had a legitimate grievance about, I even hate using the word legitimate because I don't want that to be taken out of context, but he had an understandable grievance from his perspective about NATO with nuclear capabilities being right on his doorstep.
Well, by that logic, then, don't you then think Poland has a very legitimate reason to be worried about these developments because it's also a member of NATO. It's also on the border. Finland is also worried. When I was in Poland late last year, that was a huge topic of conversation, and Poland's history is very similar to Ukraine's. But NATO is also in place to also protect each other member from incursion from being invaded by member nations or any other nation for that matter. One being attacked means they all come to their defense. Canada is a member of NATO. And, people also don't realize that Canada was instrumental in creating the United Nations.
That doesn't score points with some of us.
Well, the whole peacekeeping concept, that was a Canadian concept. That's where that started. Canada, there was a big debate many years ago about whether or not Canada should be officially neutral as Switzerland. So Canadians are not aggressive or warmongering in that sense. They tend to be more a live and let live kind of country. And that's one of the things people find attractive about it. And that's why so many immigrants come to Canada. And Canada is a net immigration country. Its population would never have grown the way it has without immigration. So
but let us say this about that, because one of the other grievances that the current administration has articulated about Canada is the amount of fentanyl that now comes pouring through the northern border. You're saying that, but look, my experience with just watching reality television, slap me, is that the Canadians do take, they are conscious of, to a high degree, people coming into the country. And they take steps to make sure that if you enter the country, you're not just going to come in and take Canadian jobs, for instance. They're very, very focused on entry into the country. Now, I don't know whether the borders are as porous as our southern border was, where you had literally thousands, tens of thousands of people pouring in to Canada unvetted. But at least entry into Canada seems to be something that the Canadian government takes very seriously.
You'll remember a few years back, was it the Syrian refugees? They were crossing from the United States, walking across the border into Quebec, and the Mounties were there to meet them, feed them, put them in a warm facility, and then take them for processing through immigration. Canada still has an asylum system in place. People still can claim refugee status in Canada. So it's becoming more of a popular destination, the less the United States is open to that. So,
good. Hopefully, Trendiagua people can come up to Canada.
People can go anywhere in the world, anywhere.
All these Trendiagua types in Venezuela, the ones that are coming here.
All five of them, right?
No, they're not five of them. In fact, that's the
five that were deported. Yeah,
it's more than that were deported. I guess you didn't see the picture. All these guys that El Salvador, thank you, El Salvador, took in. Hundreds.
We're going off, and as we are wont to do, we're going off into tangents here now. So
yes, I understand that, but it started from the Canada immigration thing. So you guys are a nation of immigrants. You want more. I'm just saying.
So.
Get a hold of Venezuela, get a hold of Mexico, and tell them to just do, there's that long Pacific Ocean. We have cruises. You can give these guys an all-inclusive cruise from down there in Mexico right straight up to Vancouver. Have at it. No reply.
What are they going to do? Walk across the border? Walk through the United States? No.
No, those days are over. Our border shut down for the time being.
Well, you can't, as you know, board a cruise ship without a passport and all of that too. So you can't.
Canadians are forgiven as long as they don't stop in the United States. That's what I'm saying. You do a direct cruise from Mexico, from down there in Cancun somewhere, right up to what is it? Victoria. The expensive Vancouver, the very expensive liberal city up there.
Vancouver's not that liberal anymore.
What do you mean?
The quote-unquote liberal government that has been running the province of British Columbia is really conservatives in disguise. So they were once the Social Credit Party, which was very much a capitalist conservative party, and they reformulated, renamed because they became so unpopular. They turned into the Liberals. The Liberals are probably more right of center than liberals elsewhere in the country.
Hmm. All right, but getting back to okay, so we got this election that's going to happen now. You got this new prime minister. What's his name?
Mark Carney.
Markey. So we got Markey as the new prime minister up there. And I was so unclear. I kept waiting for Justin Trudeau to leave, and he just wouldn't leave. And finally, he just gave up last week. It was. He said, "Okay, I'm out." All right. So, what can we expect from Mr. Markey?
Wow. The man is measured, thoughtful, quite brilliant, practiced in diplomacy. But he was born and raised in northwest Yukon, Yellowknife, Yukon area. And he comes from small northwestern British Columbia, raised in Edmonton, which is kind of one of the oil capitals of Canada. He knows what it is to be a small town Canadian, but he's also worked in some of the most important financial institutions in the world as the governor of the Bank of Canada, the governor of the Bank of England, the first non-British to even have that position. He's, I guess basically my perspective is he's extremely competent, not too exciting, a little on the boring side. One-on-one, he's funny, he's personable, but he's a very measured person. I think that he steered Canada through the Great Recession. What was that? Back in the late 80s. He steered Great Britain through Brexit. Well, I think he's in a very good position to steer Canada through the economic catastrophe that's facing it right now. The question is whether his personal popularity and the fact that he's with the Liberals is not helping him, but it's whether he can actually pull off salvaging the Liberal Party as the government of Canada. Pierre Poilievre has never worked. He's always been a politician. He was one of the youngest in Canada at one point in time. And basically he's seen as a mini MAGA. And that's not a real popular perception to have right now. So he's lost something like a 20
it's 20 points within 2 weeks.
Yeah, and it's neck and neck. And I think Carney, he's a numbers guy. He's going to analyze and figure out the best. He's got until October. You don't want to leave it to the last minute. But if the numbers are lining up, I think he'll call an election quite soon.
So you think he might call the election before October?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I do. Yeah, that's, he's got at least...
Now, of course, I like Poilievre. They can call him mini MAGA, whatever. I like that guy a lot from what he's saying. But what you're saying is he has no practical experience other than he has no private sector experience. His experience is all in the public sector.
Right. Yeah.
He talks great.
Some might think so.
I'm one of those. I do. The guy. I like what I hear out of Poilievre. I mean, he's a little upset right now with the United States.
He also comes from Alberta, and Alberta tends to be more aligned with the right side of the ledger. Alberta's always been the right-wing province, British Columbia, the left-wing province, and then everybody's kind of scattered in between. But at the end of the day, you have a federal election in Canada. Quebec votes, Ontario votes, the rest of the province might as well close the voting booths and go home, because once those two vote, if they're strongly behind one party or the other, the election's over. So,
wait a minute. So wait a minute. It's where now? It's
Ontario
Alberta.
and Quebec.
And the two provinces, Alberta and Quebec?
Ontario and Quebec.
Ontario and Quebec. Once Ontario weighs in Quebec, if they're aligned, that's it. It's done.
Yeah.
So then the poor folks out there in British Columbia, just with everybody else, you just go along with, yeah.
Well, at that point, you go home. You don't bother voting. If the results are showing that the elections, all the seats have been spoken for by one party, the election's pretty much over. I mean, that is one of the big debates that have been going on in Canada for decades about it's a representational government, but the bulk of the population's right there in those two provinces. I mean, Ontario's got the biggest, Quebec's second. After that, it's a smattering here and there. British Columbia, I think it might be up to 3 million people now. Alberta, I don't even know what that is, but
you guys might want to look at this electoral college thing. Kind of works for us to make sure that that people don't get wiped out by big population centers. The genius of the founding fathers of America and the electoral college. Really, I'm very serious about that, because if we had that, the same thing would happen here. You'd get New York, you'd get L.A., San Francisco, Atlanta, what else, and one or two, Chicago. And if that's it, at the end of that, just close it down. Everybody else is done. But the genius of the electoral college system is that that's not the fate that America's electorate has. Now, we have admittedly other challenges, but I think there was some genius behind this electoral college thing. Okay, so you've got, it's going to come down to Poilievre, and it's going to come down to Mark Carney.
Carney.
Huh? Carney. Like I said, Carney. Like Carnival, Carney. So you've, so, which I don't know the guy. I mean, I'm open to learning more about him. You say he's very distinguished. He's done all these wonderful things. So it's going to come down to Poilievre and Carney. Who right now, who would you roll the dice for?
I'd roll the dice for Carney right at the moment. You know, yeah. Again, I think that the political situation in the U.S. has really flipped the switch in terms of Canadians' feelings. They were extremely unhappy with Trudeau. I mean, I've been hearing from friends, relatives, family for years about how awful Trudeau was and how much they despised him. Interestingly enough, his father went through the same thing, and now he's considered one of the greatest politicians Canada ever had. But
that ain't going to be Justin's history, by the way. That will not be the legacy of Justin Trudeau.
Well, Canadians are well known for eating their politicians, turning on them very quickly. Canadians, well, I'm Canadian, I can say this, but basically Canadians are enormous navel gazers, and I think that sometimes things are so good in the country that you got to find something to bitch about. And so it's going to be, their politics is a kitchen table sport. You can sit around the table, argue, fight, and everybody's cool. Nobody brings out the guns and nobody starts punching each other out. Everything is cool. But people are very engaged in their politics and their politicians. Feel very strongly about it. People tend to vote strategically in Canada. Yes, there's a lot of emotion, but when push comes to shove, people will vote for what they think will work out best for the country. And that's why I think Carney's got the edge right now, because people are dead set against anything that's happening out of DC at the moment.
All right, now you said, and I'm not going to minimize this, and I'm not going to take this lightly, what you said, because I think this is the fear, and I'm not going to joke about it either. You termed what is happening now, the fear is palatable that this could bring economic ruination to Canada.
Yes, very much so. I mean, the other part that happened in this equation is that now that Trump has opened these doors, China's let through them and is hitting Canada with all kinds of tariffs of its own on issues that relate back to a year ago. So it's a 1-2 punch.
What are you talking about?
Well, China is imposing tariffs on Canadian goods, very similar to what Trump is doing. So, you know, the other...
What is the rationale? I'm sorry, what's the rationale with China? That Canadian won't let Chinese products into Canada? Are they using the same rationale?
Yeah, they're using the rationale that they can't access, you know, the agricultural sector.
Well, hell, this is China we're talking about. China markets are freaking closed to anybody that the commies over there don't want in their markets.
All of this began a few years back when the United States asked Canada to not incarcerate, but to, it was a woman who, I think she was the daughter of the owner of TikTok or something like that. I can't remember specifically now, but they asked her, the United States asked Canada to detain her. Canada did, being a good neighbor, Well, since then, Canada has been on the bad list of China for doing that because she was a very prominent person, a very important person in China. So it's been a little titchy between China for these last several years too. Thank you, USA. And, it's one of those, do a favor for the US, get your head bit off. But one of the points I want to make, Elliot, is that, James, is that all the things that Trump may want out of Canada, so does China. China is one of the biggest consumers as well. Canadian fish, timber, minerals, resources. Those are all the things Trump wants. China also is poking its way into the Northwest Territories. So, I think it's people have kind of not seen that part of it.
See, this is interestingly because then you guys might really want to consider this 51st state thing as a hedge against China.
Well, we might want to join China as a hedge against the United States.
You will not want to join commie China.
Do you know how many people of Asian descent live in Canada? Do you know how many?
There is no way. We're not going to put China on our doorstep. That's not going to happen. You're talking about that would be truly a mistake because you know where that heads. That's really dangerous.
Any move that is made by Canada is going to be dangerous at this point in time. Yeah, Trump has put the squeeze, and Canada is going to use whatever.
Okay, how do you see? Okay, 3 years from now, where do you think all this ends up?
That's a tough one. I know during the last recession, it took Canada something like 10 years to pull out of it. I have a feeling that's probably going to happen again. I'm not an economist, but I do think that unless Canada can forge alliances with important partners in the world, it's going to be in a really tough position, struggling for its economic life. I hope that doesn't happen. But, who's got the crystal ball? We're dealing with a president who's so unpredictable. You just don't know what the next day is going to bring. So it's hard to say what direction we're heading in. Next thing we know, we may have the Americans and the Russians on our northern border. We may have the Russians coming from the north, the Americans coming from the south. It's just too hard to predict right now.
We want to protect Canada.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yes, we do. First of all,
the government wants to protect women, and
stop. Let's not do Orange Man stuff. But I'm just telling you, we want to protect Canada. We love the Canadian people. We love Canada. You guys are like us.
A funny way of showing their love.
Look, things are a little difficult at the moment, but we love Canada, and I'm sure that this is all going to end up tickety-boo.
Tickety-boo. The other part of all of this that people haven't given much thought to are all the little communities along the border, Campobello Island, Point Roberts, Stewart, Hyder, Alaska. These are places that the American population or the Canadian population can't function without crossing borders, can't get supplies, so, and the other part, well, it just keeps going on, but the other part about, the talk of reconfiguring and the border and saying that the border treaties can all be tossed out because they're not valid, there's a lot going on.
Look, what you can keep your national anthem.
Oh, thank you. Very kind of you. The true north, strong and free.
Like I said, I'm not going to make light of it. But I do want to check in with you from time to time. We're going to do this and just check in on more of what happens with this. I think it's really interesting. And I don't say interesting as a brush off. I think that we are certainly living in interesting times. We haven't even talked about Greenland yet. Clearly there is what you just said about China and Canada. I think there's a lot more going on here than I'm seeing from a national security standpoint. Something I just get the feeling there is some bigger objective than what I'm seeing here on the table.
There may well be, but the problem lies in the fact that there had been stability, prosperity, there had been an understanding of how things were going to operate. All of that is being tossed out or reinterpreted, and everything is willy-nilly. There's no predictability. Nobody knows what to expect. In the meantime, there are other bad actors who are jumping in and taking advantage of the situation.
Well, I'll tell you one thing that I think is beneficial for this. Number one, and this may be what we should do next, rather than just kind of, let's talk about the EU, because I am so freaking happy that this president is finally dealing with this EU arrogance over the way that markets are held, over the way that trade is held with the EU, over the way that they've been expecting us since the end of World War II to pay all their defense costs while they run off this incredibly expensive welfare state mentality with the United States shouldering all the burden. I think it's legitimately that relationship between the United States and the European Union is going to have to change. And I don't see how, with what is on the table now, I think it will actually benefit the EU, and I think it will actually benefit the United States. But I'll let you respond to that really quickly. I don't want to just shut it off.
Well, I do think it is going to change all those relationships. And I do think that even members of the EU are starting to agree with the fact that they do need to be much more self-sufficient, as, Canada is as well. So basically, what will happen is countries will be less dependent on each other. The question is whether the alliances, the treaties, the agreements, the international rules that everybody had agreed to, are those going to still be in place? Or is anything like that going to remain in place? Or are we going to balkanize ourselves into a place where everybody's going to try and gobble up everybody? That's, to me, the question.
I'll tell you one thing that does scare me about that, though. And that's, we have had 2 world wars because Germany was able to arm themselves. So now when we talk about the German engineering and industrial might, perhaps rearming again, the mentality in Germany is different for now, today.
A lot of other countries are arming. A lot of other countries are arming, and they're not stable either.
And so that's where I think, and as I said to you before, one of the things that always concerns me is not what I'm seeing today, but unintended consequences and the law of unintended consequences. Now, I don't think that in any way should stop America from taking a more aggressive stance toward being beat up by these tariffs with some of these other countries, where we're defending these countries, where it's us. The United States was NATO for the most part. Without the United States investment, NATO would have been done, because these other nations refused to honor their own commitments to pay for their.
I don't recall anybody holding a gun to the Americans' head in order to get that funding. I seem to recall the American delegations approved it.
Well, those days are over.
A decision, and now they don't want to abide by it.
Those days are over. We're tired of being the whipping boy.
Right. So, saying that somehow everybody forced America into this, not quite. America stepped up.
Okay, so I hear you on that. So this was a role that we wanted too, because we like this thing of being, quote unquote, the world's policeman, big bad United States. Okay, but those days are over.
Right.
Maybe. Because I'll tell you what, this goes off into more tangents. We've almost been here for an hour. But I tell you what, we have midterm elections coming up. And if the Republican Party cannot hold the House or the Senate in the midterm elections, all bets are off on a lot of the stuff that we're talking about that looks today.
Well, executive orders are still executive orders.
Yes, but executive orders aren't legislation. And the problem with executive orders is that if you spend the next 2 years in gridlock and then there's such a climate from the gridlock that puts your party out of power, every single executive order that's written today can be, as we are seeing, turned over tomorrow.
Right. But in the meantime, 4 years can do a lot of damage in a lot of places, depending on.
Well, it did. And thankfully, 47 is fixing the damage that happened the last 4 years. And on that happy note.
Yeah, well, yeah, we can spend 3 hours debating these things, as you well know. So given time constraints, we again will agree to disagree on some of these issues.
On some of these issues, we will. But one thing that I will not disagree on, we both love Canada. I love the United States, of course. United States is it, but I love my Canadian friends. I love Canada, the Canadian people, and I am hopeful that as we go through this reordering of things, that the Canadian people will not be hurt. I really mean that. I do not want to see my Canadian friends hurt. I don't want to see Canadian economy hurt. I don't want to see the Canadian people hurt. And I hope we can find a solution for all of these things where we can get what we need here in America, which is a better relationship with Canada. And I just hope that we can do it in a way that does not hurt the Canadian people. I mean, I really hope that that's the case.
Well, it's eminently doable. The question is whether the will is there, and I don't think the will is there.
Well, we'll see. I hope you're wrong about that. Anyway, so now that you put your toe in the water,
you dragged me into the deep end.
Yes. So now that you put your toe in the water, we will be speaking with you more in these podcasts. Yes?
Be kind.
Yes? Yes?
Yes.
Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is Debi Pelletier. You wait till we start talking about the media landscape. Things are going to get really interesting then. All right, Debi, thank you so much. We'll catch you on the flip side.
Thank you. Take care.
All righty. Bye-bye.